Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to this workshop on careers in media, an introduction to the field of journalism and broadcast media, brought to you by our Employability and Upskilling Scheme. My name is Rukmini. I'm a project officer for the Employability Upskilling and Mentoring program at Blossom LGBTQ. For your reference, I use they, them pronouns. This evening, our host Shiv will speak to all of you about the world of journalism, broadcasting, and being a queer media person. As the digital public has increased, so has the scope for careers in media. This webinar aims to address these changes to provide insight into the world of digital journalism and the possibilities of creating engaging and informative content using the reach of social media. Shiv, who uses they, them pronouns, has worked at the BBC, Guardian, and more before becoming a freelance journalist. They took an unusual route to this industry. We are going to find out what working in the media is like for LGBTQ plus people and how they got there. Without further ado, then, let's begin this wonderful webinar. And please remember to scan the QR code that's on the screen right now for any questions and any comments you may have throughout. You have the option of staying anonymous. Shiv, I leave it to you now.
Shiv, you're muted, sorry.
Am I unmuted now? Okay, sorry about that, technical issues. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Rukmini. Yeah, my name's Shiv, my pronouns are they, them. I'm a journalist, I'm a broadcaster, I'm a TikToker, and I do a variety of different things. And the way I got into journalism and the media was not through any any sort of professional qualification or even degree in the subject. So I'll talk you through how I got into that space and why I did what I did. But let's sort of start off with the media, because this is quite a big industry. It's a huge space. You've got your factual media and your fiction kind of things, the TV shows, stuff that you might be watching on Netflix or iPlayer or whatever it is. And then you've got documentaries and news and things that are based on fact. And that was what I was always really drawn to. As a kid, I always wanted to know like what the truth was about stuff. And in having that fascination, I ended up looking at science degrees. I ended up studying physics at university, and that was sort of my way of feeding my curiosity. When I was studying, I kind of realized I didn't want to spend my life working in physics or in a lab or doing equations all the time. So I ended up looking at other career paths that I could do with a background in science. And one of those career paths was to be a science journalist. So I would let other people do the research, and then I would bring that research to whoever I could. What's really important about that is the fact that when you do work in the media and you are that mouthpiece for the information that lots of people are going to be receiving, is the fact that you need to be able to find the right people to tell you the right information at the right time. And I think a lot of the things that we see in media now sort of has deviated away from that as an idea. A lot of the time we'll see things on the TV where two people will have different opinions and shout at each other. And I will come on to why I think that's not necessarily the best form of using your space or your platform as a journalist. But there are lots of different ways out there to communicate issues. Having two people scream at each other is just one of those ways. I started my career doing science journalism. Then I moved into more general journalism and got very interested in human rights issues around the world. from there, I also became a lot more comfortable with my gender and my sexuality, and I started talking more openly about LGBT issues, specifically under the human rights umbrella, and looking at the ways in which different countries and different laws affect people in those areas. At the time when I started this, I'd like to say lots has changed. We've come a long way since then. Sadly, lots has changed. We have come a long way, but sadly, there's still a lot of work to do in that space. Hence, I still have a job in that space. But I would very much like to not need to have one to cover these kinds of stories. I also want to say just now, if you have any questions or want to ask anything specific about my journey or how to get a job in the media or anything at all, put them in the QR code thing, and I'll get to them as well. So that's my introduction to me. I want to talk a bit about what journalism is. So journalism is the idea that you are finding out information and you are sharing that information, usually for the benefit of the public. There usually has to be a public interest argument. So, your mate's gossip isn't something that you might see in a news story. What you might see in a news story is government officials or big industry bosses making decisions or saying things that could positively or negatively affect the people in the country or their employees or things like that. So journalism is about finding out the information that can either positively or negatively be of interest to the general population. And within that, you have specific areas. So you'll have science for one, or LGBT issues, or music and arts. They might not be topics that everyone across the country is interested in, but sort of generally people would be interested in. And the reason that the way that you can kind of work out whether a news story is a big story or if it is something worth reporting on is by thinking, how many people does this affect? Number one. I have a personal scale of how outrageous is this? Like how surprising or shocking is this information to people that they should be aware of it, even if not that many people are being affected by it. And also I have a stance on looking at what does it do? What does it mean? What does it change? So if it's a change in law, why is that? Why should people care? Why does that matter? And those are sort of the policy, that the bullet points in my mind as to whether or not I think I should continue working along a story. And working along a story means you have your idea of what's going on, and you look at that idea from all the angles that you possibly can. You try and work out who is being affected. So who is being, who is the sort of case study of the story? Who is the person doing the thing? So is it a property developer is developing a new property? They would be the main body, and then you have the case study, which would be the person affected by what they're doing. And that sort of gives the story a bit of context as to why it does or doesn't matter so much that we're reporting on this. And when you are looking at these kinds of things, there's a bit of a doom and gloom bit here. When you're looking at these kinds of things, it's a bit gutting, because within a newsroom space, you work with a huge team. There'll be editors, copy editors, writers, researchers, assistants, and it takes everybody to make the story come together. But there are people always higher up the ladder who can decide whether or not they do or don't want to publish that story or spend time researching it or looking into it. And so it can be difficult when you are considered to be niche. And by that, I mean anything that isn't sort of national political news. There's always a chance of getting your work stopped in its tracks. There are some ways around that, and those are sort of to work for organizations that really champion the kind of work that you do. For example, if you wanted to be a journalist covering the party scene or raves or new music, Vice might be a really good option to go to. If you wanted to be a journalist covering arts and theatre and stuff like that, then The Guardian might be a good place to go to. If you wanted to cover sort of more pop culture stuff, there's the BBC's BBC's Newsbeat on Radio 1. So you can kind of look for opportunities in areas where they align more closely with what you want to work with. But as Rukmini said right at the beginning of this, one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the last, say, 10 years really is where things started to change quite dramatically, is obviously the rise of social media and the ways in which social media has allowed everyone to become their own journalist of sorts. Whether you're taking pictures of your lunch and sharing that, or you're making memes about breaking news issues, whatever it might be, that there's this ability there that social media has allowed us to make the news and information sharing space a bit more democratic. Anyone can share their news and share their information. It doesn't have to be decided upon by somebody else who thinks it is or isn't worth talking about that issue. And that is potentially quite an exciting thing to be a part of. It's also potentially quite a terrifying thing to be a part of, as the industry has changed over the years. It's not always been used for good, this idea that anybody could suddenly become a journalist or a broadcaster. And that's how we've seen a huge rise in the spread of disinformation and misinformation. And a lot of that has then eked out into more general, direct hatred for particularly queer people, people of colour. And it's a tough space to be in if you are one of those in a marginalised group, let alone if you're in multiple of those marginalised groups. So yeah, please do send your questions in if you have any burning desire to know anything. I am going to talk a little bit about what it's like I'm going to talk a little bit about how to actually get into the media industry and the news industry. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about what it's like as a queer person of colour in that industry. So if you have any questions about those things, send them and I'll try and answer them as I talk. Or if you would like me to talk about something else, put that in the thing and I will try and get to that if we have time as well. So to talk first about physically getting into the news industry, there are lots of different organisations in the UK and around the world where people are being people are able to apply for apprenticeships or trainee schemes. Most of the large news organisations have formal trainee schemes where they are structured in a way where you get to see lots of different departments. You get to learn about the different roles within a news team. If you're looking more at broadcast news like the BBC or Sky, you might learn about camera operation as well as journalism. If you're looking at more traditional journalism like written word, then again, all of these places have trainee schemes, the big ones, the main ones, so the newspapers and the Guardian, the BBC, Sky, all of those places have those kinds of schemes. And I would highly recommend that if that's something that you want to do, applying via one of those schemes is a very good way to try and get your foot in the door. Unfortunately, though, this is an industry where there are lots of people applying for the jobs and there aren't that many jobs to go around. It's also a space where there are lots of elements of sort of catch-22 situations, like you need experience to get more experience type thing, which is a bit of an oxymoron. So if you're feeling like, you're applying for things and it's not working out, then the next step is to make it happen for yourself. So the beauty of the idea that the internet has democratized the media is the fact that you can start to be your own journalist and you can broadcast from your phone, you can write your own blog, you can do so many things. And one of the jobs that I've had was actually for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is a pretty large, very highly regarded news organization for global news audience. They're kind of known for having that as a basis. And I worked for them for a number of years, making news for TikTok. So it wasn't all silly dances, but there was a lot of silly dancing. There's a lot of news that happens on TikTok in various ways that has really changed the way people consume news as well. So I would recommend looking at the Washington Post's TikTok channel. They do more like sketches, or another freelance journalist called Sophia Smith-Gaylor. She is a writer and a journalist, and she sits down with a camera and talks to the camera about the story that she wants to talk about. So she's not doing any dances or sketches or anything ridiculous. And I think I did a mix of that. I did a lot of silly dancing when the story allowed for it, when it was a happy, maybe upbeat story. And when things got serious, I tried to be a bit more serious about it. And I think that's a big point in journalism and news, is being able to get the tone right of what you are discussing. It's really important, almost like with acting, to be able to make sure that you are able to deliver what information you're delivering in a way that gives the audience an idea of how they should be feeling about what it is you're talking about. For example, during COVID, there was obviously a lot of horrible, terrible news, and it was important to make sure that you're not reporting on those stories with a big cheesy smile on your face, because you're often talking about people who have lost their lives. If, on the other hand, there's a story about this is actually a story that I once reported on. A dog jumped in a canal to save his owner, who was a toddler, and the dog jumped in to try and save the toddler, and the parent got in the end to actually save both of them. But that's quite a nice, happy story. So that's the kind of thing where you want to talk a little bit lighter, you want to change the tone, you want to make people feel like it's okay to enjoy that news and feel happy about that news. So it's one of those things where, as a journalist, you're thinking about lots of different elements, particularly if you're working in broadcasting. But it is important to make sure you can get those elements down and do them. And that's kind of why sometimes it's hard to get the job without having any experience. So I highly recommend, if you're looking for a job in journalism and you're knocking on doors and it's not working out, start doing it yourself. And I know that's not an answer for everybody, because I know that you probably wouldn't get paid at the beginning, at least, and it takes a lot of time and effort. And if you don't have the resources, that's really tough. But if you do have those resources and you do have the time, it's such a great way to get your name out there and to just show people what you can do. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to show that you've got the initiative to go out and get the stories that you want to talk about. And even now, I've been working in journalism for 6 years, 7 years. And even now, I still have social media accounts where I talk about news and I talk about what's going on, and I share the stories that interest me. Partly because lots of people who follow me do follow me because they think that they're going to get news from me and they want to see that from me in the way that I do that. And partly because people who then go on to hire me contact me through those social media channels saying, oh, I've seen this, would you like to come on our TV show and talk about this topic that you were talking about so passionately? So there's a combination there as to which way, which reason why you might want to be posting on social media with your work. But ultimately, it is something that acts as your portfolio. So you might be used to writing a CV or a cover letter. With jobs in particularly the media, you will also be asked to supply a show reel or an element of an example of some of the work that you've done. And that's massively important. And therefore, having a back catalogue that you can go to say, look, I know it's maybe not professional studio quality, but I was doing what I could with what I had. That really does go a long way. Yeah. And so just a reminder to send in any questions if you've got any questions. If you don't have any questions and you don't know what to ask, or if you want to say anything about the session, please leave feedback on the QR code. And if there are no questions, probably going to wrap up in about 10 or 15 minutes. So get your questions in while you can. So I want to talk about a little bit about what it is like as a queer person of color in the media. I, again, am a person who didn't go to Oxford. I didn't study journalism. I didn't study media. And those things can give you an advantage because there is an element of nepotism, like with a lot of different industries. People tend to be connected from having gone to those types of universities and studied those types of courses. They give each other sort of little jobs here and there. I wasn't in that boat, and it was a difficult thing to try and navigate. One thing that helped was having the social media online portfolio. Another thing was really carving out my specialty. So being able to have an interest and discuss science in a way that other people might find interesting was a real bonus. And there is almost an area of journalism for everything that someone is interested in, whether that's birds, whether that's flowers, whether that's gaming, whether that's trying to think of something like completely random. But there is almost a job in journalism for any of those things. It's just your audience might not be as big. So you might, if you're really interested in cars, you want to write about car news, that might be a car magazine that you work for rather than a national broadcaster. But that's okay, because you're writing about what you're passionate about, and also it gives you an opportunity to get stuck into what you care about. So when you are knocking on those doors, trying to get those jobs, applying for them, and say you get your first job in the media, and everyone around you seems to know each other, and a lot of them look the same and talk the same and sound the same and grew up in the same areas, it can be really daunting. It can be really scary. And unfortunately, as a trans person myself, it's more than that, because a lot of the time you're reporting on or seeing stories about your community. I think particularly for trans people in the last couple of years, there's been a ridiculous number of stories about us in the press. A lot of them have been ill-informed, factually incorrect, and downright transphobic. And as a trans person working in that space, it can be quite difficult to remain somewhat professional while also trying to argue against the fact that this stuff is bad and it's scary. And I do feel like there has to be an element of having those trans voices in the room in order to be able to make sure that what does get published isn't necessarily always just people saying what they think, and that there's somebody with actual experience and actual expertise on issues that trans people experience, rather than maybe fantasy that might otherwise get published, the ideas that people have rather than actual reality. But it is tough, and I'm not gonna lie about that. I've experienced death threats. I've experienced trolling from quite big figures who have thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of followers, and who get their followers to sort of pile on me. And it is really, really tough when that happens. I'm only human. I'm a person just like anybody else. I've got feelings. I've got emotions, and it can be tough. It can be scary. But what's really important is having a system around you. And unfortunately, I think as trans people or queer people, we do unfortunately have to get used to the idea that we need to have a support network around us, whether that's our friends or our chosen family or our biological family, whoever it might be. Being able to lean on people around you for that support is so massively important. And so if a career in the media is something that you would like to do and is something that you're really considering, I'm not saying day one you'll have to have a support system in place, because otherwise it'll be terrible. I'm just saying that be aware that hearing negative things about the queer and trans community over and over again can get really devastating, and it can take a toll on you mentally. And so having a space to be able to breathe and let go of some of that pent-up emotion and feeling and negativity is vital, and having people around you that you can trust and who support you is important as well. But it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all scary. As a trans person in the media, it's really nice. People often are very lovely. It's sadly a lot of the time you remember the negativity and you often forget to focus on the positivity. And it is really nice because I have young trans people or queer people come contact me on social media or whatever it might be, and say, oh, I really enjoyed the fact that you were there to be able to speak up for the non-binary community or to speak up for the trans community. And they really do mean that, and that's really, really lovely to be able to provide a space for people to feel like they're being represented. I've also had people contact me saying that it's only through the way that I've discussed gender stuff that they've then realised that they're maybe not the cis het person that they thought they were, which is a really lovely thing to be able to feature in someone's journey with getting to know themselves a little bit better. And it's important as well to be able to make sure that there is real representation for what being part of the queer community is. So yeah, being able to actually represent a group of people, I never would say, oh, I'm talking about the whole community. I'd always say I'm only talking for my example, but I do know there are variations in that is an important thing to do, but also a lovely thing to be able to provide a little bit of representation for something that I never had growing up, and lots of us haven't really had a whole lot of fair representation of our community. Yep, I've got a question that's come in. So what are the ethical considerations for media professionals when reporting on conflicts and wars, given the industry's tendency to profit from such things? It's interesting because actually I think the way in which the media industry profits is yes, through often hypercapitalization, which often does mean that the money is somewhere linked back to conflict. The idea of any good, any impartial newsroom, any sort of national news organization that you would consider to be fair, in theory, should be completely 100% separate editorially from any funders or anywhere the money comes from. But we know that that's not the case. And I can tell you that that's not the case because I work for an organization every now and then. And as part of my contract, it says that I'm not allowed to talk about any other organizations within the company that are in a negative way. Even if they're massively different to the one that I work for, even if they've got completely different editorial standards. So it is really difficult, I think, sometimes for journalists to be able to be open about what's going on, because sometimes there is this tendency, this idea that you have to report on things that don't negatively impact the company, to bring the company into disrepute. Now, would media professionals may often struggle with this as a concept, because they are ultimately not the ones able to make the decisions. A journalist isn't ultimately. Journalists might want to report on something and might be told that they're not allowed to, because of what editors or bosses higher up might say or do say. That's not to say that there's this big conspiracy that all journalists are being told, oh, you're not allowed to talk about, well, the obvious example right now is genocide in Palestine and Gaza. I don't think that that's what's happening in newsrooms, but a lot of the media is very cautious to use with the language that they choose to use, because they are in a place where they could be ultimately sued or penalized in some way for what they've reported on. By that I mean there are certain laws that you have to follow that would apply to news outlets and media organizations. It's called media law. And so if a news outlet was to say something that was incorrect, and there was somebody who was perhaps spoken negatively about, or a group of people or a country that was negatively spoken about, and that country took an issue with that news outlet for saying whatever they said, if they can prove that it's not true, then it's something that where the news outlet that did the thing could be in a lot of serious trouble. And I think, unfortunately, the media is at the moment not extremely profitable in terms of where they get their money from. In subscriber models doesn't tend to work when it's news media. It seems to work really well for places like Netflix and Disney Plus and those sorts of things, but it doesn't work as well for the news. People have stopped buying newspapers. Everyone wants to read everything online for free. So it is a bit more challenging, and therefore the broadcast traditional media might be a little bit more cautious or nervous, because they don't want to get sued ultimately, and they don't want to lose a revenue stream, which is a very difficult way to look at it, but is ultimately the way it gets looked at because of the fact that if they lose a revenue stream and they can't afford to pay their journalists, then the journalists aren't going to be able to do the work, and then you're not going to get to know about the stories. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. Another sort of, I just want to touch more on the ethical considerations for media professionals in general. There are certain papers and outlets and organizations that may not align with your own viewpoints. So there are some organizations like the BBC which claims to be impartial. That means they don't pick sides on things. We can spend hours talking about whether or not the BBC is actually impartial or if it's not impartial. But that's not the point of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there are certain papers that are a little bit more politically left-leaning or right-leaning, and so there are ethical considerations within that. For example, when I chose to leave The Guardian as a newspaper, or that was a decision that I made. It was in part, quite a lot in part, due to the fact that The Guardian had been writing or had been publishing a significant amount of anti-trans opinion pieces. Now, they say opinion pieces are the opinion of the writer and not the opinion of the paper or the staff at the organization, but people were allowing those things to get published. I mean, a paper like The Guardian has countless people wanting to write opinion pieces. So to choose the transphobic stuff over the anything else, to me, showed that there was an ethical, there was a decision being made there, and for me, it felt unethical to continue to work for an organization that was also stoking up flames in a culture war. So yes, there is that ethical consideration to have as well. I've got another question here, which is, how do media companies balance getting high rates with being responsible, especially when they make news stories more dramatic? And how would this affect someone's career in media? High rates. I think this question saying how, like, rates as in viewing rates and rankings and figures on how many people have read the stories and stuff. So high audience numbers, for example. How do media companies balance getting high audience numbers with being responsible, especially when they try to make news stories more dramatic? And how would this affect someone's career in the media? I think, sadly, again, in the way that social media is used by media companies, it's short, snappy headlines that are a little bit sensationalist, that make you want to click on the link to read the full story, is how a lot of it is working at the moment. And I think what's dangerous about that is most people are not clicking on the link. Most people read the headline and think, well, that's the news, and continue about their day. And there are serious considerations to be made into how those headlines are chosen, whether those headlines are truly representative of the discussion of the article. And it is usually, again, something that would be worked on with the team. So there would be a journalist, an editor, and a copy editor who would look at the story, and they would look at the most important part of the story and try and find a way of, what they call it is teasing the audience into wanting to know more about that. If you can work in the media and you can say, I don't want to write sensationalist headlines, and you won't be made to. I think, sadly, is if you don't do it, somebody else in your team will write those headlines, and your stories will go out with those headlines. But I personally believe it's a real problem. I personally, when I write my stories, try not to use sensationalist headlines and try instead to keep them short and snappy and maybe pose a question. rather than say this is it, because people might read the question, want to know the answer, rather than sort of giving an obscure message that isn't really what the article is saying at all, if that makes sense. They often will it's how do media companies balance getting high rates and being responsible? I think also, unfortunately, depending on which organizations you look at and which media companies you're getting your news from, they're not being responsible. I'm not going to name which media organizations I think are irresponsible, but there are certain ones where their clickbait headlines can be really damaging. And so this idea of like finding a balance to get the clicks and to be responsible isn't necessarily something that's a top priority for all of the organizations that are in the media landscape at the moment. And this kind of goes back to one of the ethical considerations for a media professional is, would you want to work at an organization that uses clickbait to sensationalize news and get people potentially worked up or upset for the sake of a few clicks? Or would you want to work for an organization that is fair to the story? And that's a decision for each journalist or each professional to make for themselves. I'm just going to do another little call for questions if there are any more. If there are not, I think we could probably finish soonish. I think I will hang on this call for about a minute and see if we get anything in. It's currently saying we don't have anything in, but if you're sort of frantically typing out a question, I'll wait for a little while and see if anything comes in. But if not, I feel like I've covered a lot. It is fantastic to work in the media. It's also really difficult. So if it's something that you want to do, I 100% recommend really just trying to go for it. If I've scared you off, ignore me completely, because it's something that I don't want people to feel like they can't do it because of who they are or what their background is. We need more diversity in the media to get fairer representational reporting. So please bang down those doors, make TikTok videos sharing the stories that matter to you, write a blog, make a YouTube channel, whatever it might be. Try and share those stories that are important to you, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you on the news one day.
Thank you so much, Shiv. That was absolutely wonderful. And thank you all for joining us tonight for Careers in Media, an introduction to the world of journalism and broadcast media. It's been an incredible evening of understanding how media today works and hearing about ways to engage with it professionally. As we bring this webinar to a close, let's carry forward the insights we've gained tonight, and we would love to hear from you and about your journey in this field and beyond, as Shiv was just mentioning. Please do remember that we have a mentorship program, we have a mentoring scheme, and it is here to provide you with guidance and help you and support you as you might need. So please, we feel welcome to reach out to us after the webinar is over. You can write to us, you can email us, you can DM us, you can do any of those things. Once again, thank you to Shiv for doing what they do and sharing with us their wisdom, and to all of you, our participants. And before we conclude, remember that your learning journey does not stop here, it just begins here. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may not have been able to send across to us throughout this webinar. Follow us on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on our Eventbrite, so that you can stay up to date with our upcoming events. We do workshops, we do webinars, and you can also sign up to our mailing list from our website.